Hello and welcome. My name is Jason Van Sickle, and I'm chair of the Indiana Landmarks Affinity Group, Indiana Automotive. Thank you guys all for coming out today. It's obviously this is one of the high points of the year, along with the tour and talking track when it comes to earlier. But to get members of Indiana Automotive together and um, intense auto history, if you will. With that, Indiana Automotive was founded in 2014 with the mission to celebrate Indiana's automotive heritage and promote preservation of Indiana automotive landmarks. As I mentioned, Indiana Automotive hosts regular events and raise awareness of automotive history. We're excited to announce we have a tour for 2026 planned. If many of you guys probably joined us during the Connorsville event this past summer, which was a great event. The 2026 tour is focused on the town of Speedway. It celebrated its centennial of it becoming its own incorporated town in 2026. So the dates are to be announced, but it will be in summer of 2026. So we're excited to host one of our wonderful tours here locally. So hopefully we can see a lot of you guys participating in that and really seeing that history of the town of Speedway. Before we welcome tonight's speaker, please be aware that we will reserve time at the end after the presentation for Q&A. So if you see me, raise your hand. I'll come over with the microphone to give you guys a chance to talk to Ralph, and hopefully he can answer some of those questions from that presentation. For those who are joining us via Zoom, please type those questions into the Q&A. We'll monitor that and then get your questions asked also. And obviously we have a limited time on the Q&A, so we'll try to get as many questions as we can during that. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our guest speaker, automotive historian Ralph Gaebler. Ralph Gaebler is emeritus member of the library faculty at Indiana University Bloomington, where he served for 34 years as foreign and international law librarian at the Maurer School of Law. He has long been interested in social history of the automobile, particularly the history of the automobile in Indiana. He's published articles on several Indiana automobiles. Most recently, has published articles on the Lafayette and traces of Indiana in Midwestern history and in the Society of Automotive Historians Journal. So please let me introduce Ralph to the stage. So thank you, guys.
Well, it's delightful to be here. Thank you for that kind introduction, Jason. I'm very glad to be here this evening to talk about one of my very favorite topics, the Lafayette Motors Company. It is very dangerous to offer me a microphone and an audience and an open. So I'm actually glad and relieved that I'm restricted to 60 minutes of your time this evening. And of course, this is not just a story about a car, but more importantly, a story about the relationship of that car to the community in which it was built. So without further ado, I will forge ahead. I'll begin with a basic question for consideration. Is a Lafayette important in automobile history? And before I get into that question, I'll just show a slide showing a few of the items in my collection of Lafayette literature. On the left is a rather lengthy brochure called The Lafayette of the Machine that was published at some point in 1922 and includes a great deal of technical information about the Lafayette automobile, which is a source of much of what I know about the car. The middle item is a single portfolio plate from a larger portfolio of Lafayette body styles, which I unfortunately don't own. I just own this single plate. And the item on the right there is another portfolio, a complete portfolio, issued by Lafayette in 1922 of the various body styles that were available on the car in that year. But to return to my question, I begin with a basic question for consideration. Is a Lafayette important in automobile history? In one sense, the Lafayette was just a typical, obviously now forgotten, if hopefully not forgettable, attempt to launch a new high-priced brand in the immediate post-World War I era. How many have heard of similar forgotten cars of the same era, such as the Deering Magnetic, the Kenworthy, the Argonne, the Biddle, the Meteor, the Richelieu, the Fianna, etc.? It is hard to argue that any of these, and many more, were historically significant. As we shall see, post-war economic conditions and public taste were not favorable to this kind of car. The public increasingly wanted cheap, mass-produced cars. They did not want very expensive cars requiring large amount of expert hand labor to produce in small quantities. To put it bluntly, one could persuasively argue that these cars were historically significant only in their demonstration that the car was becoming a transportation appliance rather than a craft product. In other words, cars like the Lafayette were arguably just canaries in the coal mine, showing the way not to move forward. And you may wonder why I have a screen showing these two particular items. It's because on the left, we see a 1919 Locomobile Model 48 town car with a body by Demarest, which is like the ultimate example of the automobile as a craft product in this era of automobile construction. And on the right, even though this is not a talk about ice boxes, I've included an example of an ice box to show what a typical appliance would look like in 1920. On the other hand, the Lafayette was different because it was a far grander effort than most, involving very important figures in both the automobile and the investment banking industries, and was capitalized initially at the very large sum of $6 million, which was in fact equal to its far better known competitor, the Lincoln Motor Company. Also, like the contemporaneous Lincoln, the Lafayette represented a significant leap forward in the technology of automobile production, and quite possibly had a lasting effect on the increasingly mechanized industry, although that is an open question at this time. It is also arguable that the Lafayette was important in the social and industrial history of Indianapolis. In fact, the short history of the Lafayette lies squarely at the intersection of automotive and social history, and that is what makes it truly unusual and interesting to study. But before getting into that story, let's begin with a few facts about the Lafayette Series 134 itself. And here we see two images from a leather-bound dealer album that Lafayette produced, presumably some point in late 1920 for the 1921 models. And it includes these two images of the 7-passenger touring car and also the Torpedo, which was an early version of a Phaeton. The Lafayette was launched in August 1920 as a new 1921 model, 1 month before the slightly less expensive Lincoln also hit the market. Both cars were comparatively expensive, the Lafayette being priced generally from $5,500 to $7,700 with standard coachwork. This was an exceedingly high price at the time. The man behind the Lafayette was Charles Nash, erstwhile president of General Motors, founder in 1916 of Nash Motors, which ultimately became American Motors in 1954, and one of the most important figures in the industry. Another key figure was James J. Starrow, president of Boston's prominent Lee Higginson Investment Bank and the financier behind General Motors' rapid growth under Nash's prior leadership there. In fact, Starrow briefly served as GM president himself for a couple of months. The designer of the car was a transplanted Glaswegian, D. McCall White, famous for his involvement with Packard's Jesse Vincent in the development of the Liberty V12 engine during World War I. And before that, even more importantly, as designer of Cadillac's first V8 model, the Type 51, which went on the market in late 1914 and was the world's first commercially successful car with a V8 engine. The leading figures in the day-to-day management of Lafayette also came from Cadillac, including Vice President Earl C. Howard, who had been the sales manager at Cadillac, Leo N. Burnett, who had been the advertising manager there, and J.W. Applin, who had been the chief engineer at Cadillac. Thus, Lafayette's top leadership came from GM's top echelon, and the hands-on engineering and executive talent came from Cadillac, then already a GM division. In fact, Charles Nash had Cadillac in mind when he established Lafayette Motors, as a new company completely separate from his Nash Corporation in Kenosha and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. When he left GM, his goal was to establish the new Nash automobile as a slightly better Buick at a slightly lower price. His goal in founding Lafayette Motors was similar, to build a slightly better Cadillac at a slightly lower price. To build his better Cadillac, he simply hired Cadillac's best people. However, the car that McCall White designed was in fact more like the new Lincoln Model L than the Cadillac that was Nash's target. It had a 132-inch wheelbase, like the Lincoln, torque tube drive, a 90-degree V8 engine with fork and blade connecting rods. The Lincoln had a 60-degree V8 engine, also with fork and blade connecting rods. And it had 5 big main bearings, making up more than a full third of the length of the crankshaft. This image here is from the Lafayette's first catalog issued in 1920 for the 1921 cars. A side view of the V8 engine showing very clearly the fork and blade connecting rods. And in this other image from the same catalog, you can see the 90-degree V of the engine. Like Lincoln, the Lafayette represented an approach to automobile production that emphasized very high engineering standards, precision manufacturing, and use of only the finest materials. A 1920 or 1921 booklet published locally in Indianapolis by the Hollenbeck Press for the Losey Lafayette Motors Company, which was the Indianapolis Lafayette dealer, entitled Lafayette Manufacturing Precision, described the special machines and processes used to obtain a favored tolerance of less than 1/1000th of an inch in the manufacture of the Lafayette. In fact, the company's engineering staff invented many of the machine tools used to obtain such fine tolerance. For example, pistons were perfected through 26 different operations performed on a variety of proprietary machines. Parallelism of the crank pin and wrist pinholes was checked on a machine especially designed for that single operation. Another machine was designed to ensure perfect parallelism of the piston and cylinder wall. A whole department existed to produce connecting rods. Straight rods received 42 individual operations on proprietary machines, while forked rods received 57. The idea was to surpass the quality of hand workmanship lavished on Europe's finest automobiles with a manufacturing precision only achievable with the most advanced tooling and manufacturing methods. A late 1922 booklet published by Lafayette Motors entitled The Lafayette as a Machine stated that the Lafayette engine produced 100 brake horsepower, which was a fantastic figure for the time. It proudly stated that, quote, the backbone of the Lafayette engine, the crankshaft, is a chrome nickel steel forging, which for its strength, lightness, rigidity, accuracy of workmanship, and sheer mechanical beauty is symbolic of Lafayette manufacturing quality. Despite its strength, this crankshaft was a very lightweight hollow forging of only 33 pounds, with a large diameter of 2.25 inches. In fact, the entire car was comparatively lightweight. At 4,200 pounds, it weighed a mere 42 pounds per horsepower. The name Lafayette, incidentally, came from the renewed popularity of the Marquis de Lafayette in American popular culture as a result of our involvement in World War I. In particular, when several wealthy Americans privately financed the creation of a French aero squadron called the Escadrille Américaine. More than a year before America's official entry into the war, the German government protested that the undertaking violated American neutrality. So the French government simply renamed the squadron the Escadrille Lafayette in honor of the Frenchmen's critical involvement in the American Revolution. The squadron, which was still made up of American pilots flying in the French Air Force, received even more press attention under its new, more dashing name, and thus became the source for naming Nash's new automobile. It should be noted that Nash used this name again in the 1930s for a smaller, less expensive Nash automobile, marketed off and on as a separate make. This is the Lafayette most people know about, but it had nothing to do with the original Lafayette automobile, other than the fact that it borrowed the name and was also a product of the Nash Company. The Lafayette was, without question, a magnificent machine. Yet over the course of the next 2 years, this magnificent automobile failed in the marketplace. 3,000 units were planned for the first year. In fact, only around 1,000 were produced. Notices in the local newspapers announced price cuts that made no difference when the car was so expensive in the first place, and the already less expensive competition was likewise cutting prices. An attempt was made and actually reported in the press as an accomplished fact in April 1922 to merge with Pierce Arrow under the leadership of Charles Nash. It didn't happen and wouldn't have mattered anyway because Pierce Arrow was in much worse financial shape than Lafayette. In fact, its stock price actually rose on the announcement of the Phantom deal. There's also some circumstantial evidence, mostly in the form of a curious correspondence between Lafayette Vice President Earl Howard and Edsel Ford, that Lafayette tried to sell itself to Ford in November 1921. Most intriguing is a letter from Howard ostensibly offering to sell Edsel Ford a Lafayette car, but then going on to describe in detail the virtues of the entire company. Ford didn't take the bait. This is interesting because in February 1922, Ford announced that it was buying Lincoln instead from receivers appointed by Lincoln's own board, which saved that struggling brand from a fate similar to Lafayette's. Finally, following Edsel Ford's polite refusal to buy and the failed attempt at merger, Lafayette tried to save itself by reorganizing and issuing $2 million in additional preferred stock. Then, in July 1922, came the announcement that Charles Nash would himself become directly involved in management of the company, for which reason it was moved lock, stock, and barrel to Milwaukee in December 1922, where it took up quarters in a brand new, purpose-built factory building. This building was described by Earl Howard in a 1923 Indianapolis Star article as, quote, a modern one-unit plant especially designed to its purpose, the production of quality cars in limited numbers. According to Howard, the new plant, which was a one-story structure of concrete and glass, would allow cars to be built more efficiently and economically. It was a plant where work could be routed through without wasted motion and time. Finally, the new plant would not only meet our every present need, but would also take care of all requirements that will develop in the future. If you look at this photograph of the factory, it's interesting because it's generally thought that the Lafayette was built in that three-story structure to the right, which appears to be the older building in the photograph. But that can't be true given the description of the factory by Earl Howard in the Indianapolis Star. It must be the case that the one-story building with the sawtooth roof, which in this photograph looks like the newer building, is actually the older building in which the Lafayette was built. In any case, by early 1924, Lafayette had lost $2 million, and the always practical Charles Nash simply pulled the plug on a failed venture. In all, 2,267 cars were built in its 4 model year history. As it turned out, more than half of them in Indianapolis before the move to Milwaukee. There are 2 primary reasons why the Lafayette failed. First, it was not only precision built, but also precision timed to hit the market at the height of a sharp deflationary recession that lasted from January 1920 to July 1921. From May 1920 to July 1921, industrial output declined by 30% in the US, and by an even more gruesome 60% in the automobile industry. Small, underfinanced builders of assembled cars, that is, cars assembled from purchased parts, were hit the hardest, especially if they had purchased a large supply of parts in advance at inflated prices. But the entire industry suffered. Second, the Lafayette was simply too good a car. Not surprisingly, it turns out that building a high specification car with extremely expensive purpose-built tooling and expert workmen to operate it was just as expensive, if not more so, than building less advanced cars by hand. Even without the recession, it is obvious in hindsight that the market wanted inexpensive cars, not cars like the Lafayette that very few could afford and none actually needed. It is an absolutely stunning fact that by 1923, there were already 15 million cars in the world, 84% of them in the United States, a mere 25 years after the industry first emerged in Kokomo, Indiana, which can truly be described as America's first Silicon Valley. But half of the world's automobiles were Model Ts, which could be purchased for as little as $295, and very few of them were Lafayettes or Lincolns or any other type of fine automobile. The rapid rise in automobile production between 1913 and 1929 was due primarily to the Model T and later the Model A. Thus, it is more than a little curious that so many new companies sought to enter the market at this time with very expensive products. The calculus must have been that such companies, which were mostly very small and underfinanced, sought to maximize per unit profit on the very limited number of cars they were able to produce. Apparently, it just wasn't obvious to the many new entrants that the saturation point for high-priced automobiles had long since been surpassed. The second point is particularly interesting because Charles Nash was far too shrewd a businessman not to know this. As mentioned, he wanted a less expensive Cadillac, which after recession price cuts could be purchased as a 7-passenger touring model for approximately $2,800. After price cuts, a similar Lafayette cost approximately $4,800, which made it unsaleable in what was left of the luxury car market. This pricing problem made the Lafayette Nash's single biggest mistake in his long, illustrious career. It happened because McCall White, working with apparently too long a leash, simply designed the best car he could, regardless of cost, rather than the high-value car Nash wanted. Thus, the Lafayette was probably doomed, regardless of economic circumstances, and Nash never again attempted to build a high-end luxury automobile. Thus, the Lafayette passed from history. As an automobile, the Lafayette can probably be summed up as an interesting curiosity. For a brief period of time, the factory on South Holt Road, which still exists, was the most technically advanced automobile factory in the world. For this reason alone, the Lafayette deserves to be remembered, especially in Indianapolis, where so many fine cars were built in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, but none better engineered or built than the Lafayette. Now, we turn to the other, even more interesting aspect of the Lafayette's history. This has to do with the factory just mentioned on South Holt Road, today occupied by a metal recycler who uses it solely for storage. The factory is in the area north of Kentucky Avenue, known as Mars Hill. Today, Mars Hill no longer exists as a legal entity, but the name lingers as a ghost-like remnant of the past. But at the time of its creation, in 1911, Mars Hill was one of the earliest and most ambitious examples of a planned mixed-use community in the United States. Much of the Indianapolis business community was recruited to promote its success. Most of what we know about Mars Hill comes from a pamphlet published by the Greater Indianapolis Industrial Association in 1910 or 1911. The Greater Indianapolis Industrial Association was itself founded in 1910 as a private stock association to promote Mars Hill's development. And here you can see where Mars Hill is in relationship to where the boundary of Indianapolis at the time And you can see that it's Kentucky Avenue going out to the southwest of that dotted line. So it tells you exactly that most of Mars Hill was north of Kentucky Avenue, though there was a little section to the south of it. The association purchased options to a large area some 15 minutes southwest of Indianapolis with the intention of developing it into a new city of 50,000 people. In the 1910 census, Indianapolis had a population of only 233,650. So the gargantuan scope of the Mars Hill development was apparent. The brochure promoting the development to potential lot purchasers described Mars Hills as, quote, an industrial enterprise that is the greatest in magnitude and worth ever undertaken by an American city. Although one might be skeptical of this hyperbolic claim, there is no doubting the scale of the association's ambition. It meant to kickstart a huge expansion. And one of the association's slogans was Indianapolis, 500,000 in 1920. In fact, Indianapolis's population in the 1920 census was only 314,194. And the city's population didn't actually surpass 500,000 until 1970. So ambitions at the time clearly surpassed any sober assessment of Mars Hill's true potential to ignite economic expansion. Despite its unrealistic ambition, the Greater Indianapolis Industrial Association planned well and with a good deal of creativity. It platted Mars Hill in 1911, carefully setting aside areas for factories, housing, wide downtown streets for commercial development, and areas for parks, schools, and a public library. The association also made sure that the area was well served by rail and trolley to ensure sufficient coal for the intended factories and travel facilities for those coming and going. Roads, sewers, and other infrastructure were also part of the plan. Purchasers of lots were not to be financially assessed for any of this infrastructure. In short, there was careful planning for all logistical requirements of development. There was also a good bit of creative thought put into marketing. Building lots were uniformly sized at 40 by 132 feet, all fronting on improved streets and cement sidewalks. Lots were also uniformly priced at $400, at 8% discount if purchased in cash. The association emphasized that lots so close to the city could not be sold at so low a price, but for the association's careful calculation of what would be required to finance initial purchase of the property, necessary improvements, and infrastructure, such as sewers. Interestingly, contracts for lot purchases were made with a trust company, not with the association itself, with a guarantee of reimbursement if the association failed to meet its obligations to finance development. In addition, the association was not to make the distribution of individual lots to individual purchasers. Instead, after the lots were subscribed for, purchasers were to meet and themselves decide upon a plan of apportionment. To motivate purchasers in this lottery, the association promised to give all the existing houses in the area to subscribers lucky enough to acquire a lot with one of them already on it. Not surprisingly, the pamphlet has photos of these existing homes with loving descriptions of their high quality. And speaking of the house pictured here on the screen, one such description notes that the studs in the home were made of solid black walnut, nailed in place with wooden pegs. Naturally, the association emphasized the economic multiplying effect of the Mars Hill development. It anticipated an increase of 10,000 to 12,000 skilled workers, mostly living within walking distance of their work. $6 to $8 million in factory construction, together with the increase in commercial activity and taxes this growth would bring with it. The association did line up businesses, eager to build factories by offering free land and other inducements to encourage them to relocate. It emphasized to subscribers that lot values would double with the building of the first factory. and that the economic growth generated by Mars Hill would raise real estate values throughout the city of Indianapolis. The factory in which the Lafayette automobile would eventually be built was constructed in 1913 by one of the businesses attracted by the advantages of moving to Mars Hill. The Stenotype Company, later known as the Universal Stenotype Company, was founded at Owensboro, Kentucky by Ward Stone Ireland, who patented an advanced type of stenotype machine in 1911 that became the model for all such future machines. Even the stenotype machines used today by court reporters are direct descendants of Ireland's revolutionary invention. Thus, the Stenotype Company is itself an interesting story in Indianapolis's industrial and cultural history. It was capitalized at $1.75 million, rapidly grew to 350 employees, and planned to increase its workforce to 1,000 employees and production to 300 stenotypes per day once its new plant was built on South Holt Avenue. Its plant was the second new factory built at Mars Hill, the first having been built by the Crawford Locomotive and Car Company of Streator, Illinois. The Stenotype Company enjoyed early success. Eventually, it sold over 26,000 stenotypes. However, in 1918, it suspended production of stenotypes to produce war munitions instead under contract to the U.S. government. But this contract led to a critical shortage of working capital following the war due to the government's failure to supply explosives and other materials it was contractually obligated to provide. In turn, this led to receivership and ultimately to a decision by the Superior Court on March 5, 1919, to grant a petition to sell Stenotype's assets to satisfy creditors. This was an anticlimactic end to the Stenotype Company's short and somewhat meteoric career in Indianapolis. However, there was a silk purse to be made of this sow's ear, for in early September 1919, the factory was sold to the newly organized Lafayette Motors Company. The sale to Lafayette was a major coup. According to an article published in 1920, it was probably the largest single industrial acquisition recorded in the 100-year history of the Indiana capital. In his September 1919 annual report to the Greater Indianapolis Industrial Association, President O.D. Hackett stated that, quote, "The coming of this factory to Mars Hill is the most important event in the history of the Greater Indianapolis Industrial Association." Combined with the fact that fiscal 1919 was the first profitable year of the association, the arrival of the Lafayette Motors Company allowed Hackett to state that the association was, quote, "entering on an era of prosperity." Thus, the fate of the Lafayette and the fate of Mars Hill became intertwined. The abrupt removal of the once so promising Lafayette venture to Milwaukee in December 1922 must have been a severe blow to the Greater Indianapolis Industrial Association, especially since Lafayette's failure was due to circumstances entirely beyond local control. Nevertheless, its unwillingness to remain in Indianapolis did also reflect limitations in the association's long-term plan to launch such vast industrial growth and prosperity. It was clear that in addition to adopting overambitious goals, the Indianapolis Industrial Association had also failed to undertake any real contingency planning. Yet, the Lafayette did contribute to the development of Mars Hill. It brought thousands of skilled workers to the new development, and with them a demand for new housing and infrastructure. Thus, the Lafayette Motors Company announced on March 15, 1920, the formation of the Lafayette Building Company, the purpose of which was to build up to 200 new homes for skilled employees coming from elsewhere to join the Lafayette Motors Company. Underwritten by the Fletcher American Company, the new building firm would be financed by the issuance of $500,000 in common stock and $500,000 in preferred stock at 7%. The initial offering was for $300,000 in common stock, of which the Lafayette Motors Company subscribed for $100,000 and Indianapolis businessmen for $200,000. Homes were to be sold at cost, and no officers of the Lafayette Building Company would be compensated. This was exactly how the association intended Mars Hill to be developed. As it turned out, the Lafayette Building Company was already building homes before the first Lafayette automobile left the factory. A great deal of attention was given to the proper and attractive development of this new neighborhood, which was to be built on a 110-acre tract in Mars Hill, 5 blocks west of the Lafayette factory. The homes were to represent several different architectural styles. Moreover, homes were at first to be built on alternate lots, with vacant lots between to be graded and planted with shrubbery, giving the neighborhood a park-like appearance. Finally, a wide road known as Lafayette Boulevard was to connect the new neighborhood directly with Kentucky Avenue, and perhaps also remind homeowners of their benefactor and employer. This slide here shows where Lafayette Boulevard would have been if it had been built. You can see to the right the location of the Lafayette factory, where the Lafayette factory was, and about 6 blocks over where Lafayette Boulevard would have come down to Kentucky Avenue through an area of Mars Hill that was originally set aside for factories. It was never used for factories. All the factories were on the eastern edge of the development. An article in the Indianapolis Star of November 8th, 1920, under the byline of popular local journalist Agnes McCulloch Hanna, reported that she had been informed by a young woman whom she referred to as a belle fille that the new homes being built by the Lafayette Building Company compared favorably with new homes then being built in an industrial city in England, and that, quote, more attractive and convenient houses could not be found anywhere. Belle fille reported that stoves and ice boxes furnished by the company represented the last word in equipment, and their being furnished with each house was a constant amazement. Belle fille was also enthusiastic about the architectural styles, and noted especially the bookcases and china cabinets built into the living and dining rooms. By the spring of 1921, the new neighborhood was known as Lafayette Heights, and described in a newspaper advertisement as a, quote, restricted high-class home place. At this point, 56 of the homes had already been built. Another advertisement provided further details. The houses were all designed by the well-known local architectural firm of Kopf and Wooling. All homes had 2 or 3 bedrooms, as well as other amenities, including such modern niceties as, quote, a large coat closet off the living room, a clothes closet in each bedroom, and a large linen closet. Apparently, even farmers and blue-collar workers now had sufficient clothing to require closets to put it in, no doubt partly as a result of the new automotive mobility that permitted once isolated families to shop in town. Water, sewer, electricity, and telephone service were all provided. Frontage for each home was at least 50 feet, occasionally as much as 75 feet, with lot depth of not less than 150 to 200 feet to the alley behind. Many homes had a setback of at least 40 feet, and shade trees had been planted on each lot. Perhaps most interesting, down payments ranged from $500 to $1,000. Since this represented 20% of the purchase price, it follows that most homes were about the same price as a Lafayette touring car. In his October 10, 1921 annual report to the Greater Indianapolis Industrial Association, President Hackett admitted that industrial activity in Mars Hill has been interrupted during the past year. Yet the fact remains that Mars Hill has been more fortunate than some other centers in that her industries have not closed down. Here he was referring to Lafayette, which was operating at reduced capacity, but was at least still building cars. Hackett's boosterism and enthusiasm for local development were indomitable. But unfortunately, neither Mars Hill nor Lafayette Motors were to fulfill their promise. And one wonders what happened to Lafayette Heights after Lafayette Motors abandoned Indianapolis altogether. Surely the 8-room school planned for the neighborhood, as well as churches and other community buildings, never materialized. Nor did Mars Hill ever become a thriving community of 50,000 new inhabitants. Both Mars Hill and Lafayette faded gracefully into obscurity, but this fact should not dampen our enthusiasm for their fascinating joint history. It should rather increase our interest in recovering this otherwise lost but significant piece of Indianapolis's industrial and cultural heritage. I would like to conclude by proposing a few topics for further research and consideration arising out of or related to the Mars Hill and Lafayette story. First, more than 400 different automobile brands were produced in Indiana, approximately 8% of the U.S. total. And as late as 1909, Indiana was second, albeit a distant second, in total automobile production to Michigan. This raises an important question. Why did the automobile industry ultimately fail in Indianapolis and in Indiana generally? The outlines of an answer are fairly evident, as exemplified by the history of the Lafayette Motors Company. The simple fact is that Indiana specialized in production of large, expensive automobiles, typically requiring much specialized hand labor. And as noted, the industry quickly moved beyond this model of production. Thus, most Indiana automobile companies failed in the early 1920s, even though a few famous companies, such as Marmon, Stutz, and Duesenberg, lingered unprofitably into the 1930s, when they were finished off by the Great Depression. While these famous marks attract much attention, the larger and more interesting question is why Indiana industry failed to adjust to the changing market. There is some published research comparing the industry in Cleveland to that in Detroit, which focuses on the fact that in the former, the industry was financed primarily by conservative local banks, while in the latter, it was financed largely by venture capital on a much larger and more speculative scale. Cleveland's history of automobile production was quite similar to Indianapolis's. Perhaps it would be worth tracing the history of the financing of Indianapolis's automobile industry as well, to determine whether a relative absence of speculative venture financing hindered or prevented efforts to scale up for mass production. Second, much research remains to be done tracing the evolution of manufacturing processes in the automobile industry during the 1920s. Interest has been largely focused on design innovations, such as four-wheel braking systems, automatic chassis lubrication, and constant mesh transmissions. But many innovations, such as the 90-degree two-plane V8 crankshaft and the groundbreaking monoblock Ford V8 engine of 1932, depended on breakthroughs not in design, but in the manufacturing process itself. Since automobiles are complex machines, there is much detail missing from this story. No doubt researching this and filling in the gaps would be a painstaking undertaking, but it would be interesting to know whether and to what extent the manufacturing innovations introduced by Lafayette in 1920 influenced the evolution of manufacturing processes during this crucial decade. Third, speaking of the Lafayette specifically, a very interesting question remains regarding its coachwork. There is evidence that at least some of Lafayette's standard coachwork was designed by LeBaron Incorporated. Surprisingly little is known about the activities of LeBaron in its early years in New York, but one known fact is that their first display at the New York Automobile Salon in 1922 included 4 cars, 2 on European chassis and 1 each on a Peerless and a Lafayette chassis. But we don't as yet know what body styles they were. It is also documented that standard enclosed Lafayette coachwork from 1923 onward was built by the Seaman Brothers Company of Milwaukee, although we don't know who designed it. It seems quite plausible that at least the unusual 4-door coupe introduced by Lafayette in its first catalog in August 1920 was an early design by LeBaron, which began operating as a partnership in February of that same year. I suspect the Lafayette body LeBaron displayed at the 1922 New York Salon in the Commodore Hotel was in fact the four-door coupe. And if this could be proved, it would go a long way toward confirming that LeBaron designed the very first version of that body, as well as subsequent versions. And these images are from the 1921 Lafayette catalog, the first catalog and the last catalog issued by the company. And the one on the left is obviously the 1921 four-door coupe, and the one on the right is the 1924 four-door coupe. And both of these body styles, particularly the one from 1924, because of its clean lines, simple lines, and beautiful, delicate proportionality, seem to suggest LeBaron. It also appears likely, or at least possible, that LeBaron was designing most of Lafayette's standard bodies by its final year in 1924, and possibly even building the open cars at the former Bridgeport Body Company, with which it effectively merged in January of 1924. The Bridgeport Body Company of Bridgeport, Connecticut, was a custom and small series bodybuilder, well known for its high-quality locomobile coachwork. Locomobile was also built in Bridgeport. That there was a close relationship between LeBaron and Lafayette is clear, but the exact nature of that relationship remains to be determined in detail, if the sources exist to make that possible. Fourth and last, what physically remains of Mars Hill's early development to be documented and possibly preserved? This is, of course, a local preservation question rather than an automobile history question, which brings me back to our sponsor, Indiana Landmarks, and offers me a convenient segue to conclude by once again thanking them for offering me the opportunity this evening to tell the story of the Lafayette and Mars Hill. The story does indeed demonstrate the important connection between Indiana's automobile and architectural history. Thank you. And I'd be more than happy to entertain any questions you might have and try to answer them. I have a mic.
Hi, my name is Lisa Schmitz. This is my husband, John, and we live in Lafayette Heights. We actually started a nonprofit in Mars Hill back in 2015, and it's in the old hardware store at Mars Hill Street in Farnsworth. And we actually know the owners of the building that was Lafayette Motors. It's a division of Ray's Trash. It's still owned by them. They're the demolition division, and they were really disappointed that they couldn't be here tonight. So yeah, if any of you guys want to come drive by and see it, it's at Holt and Farnsworth. It's a four-way stop by the drive-through tobacco shop. And they told me today that there were bridges and covered walkways between that large building and multiple buildings on the site. And there are still concrete footers that you can see on Farnsworth from where the old buildings were.
That's really interesting, because one of the things that Earl Howard said was advantageous about the new factory in Milwaukee was it was all under one roof. See.
Yeah, it's a very special neighborhood to us. We moved there to serve the community, and we would love to talk to you about maybe coming to speak to our neighborhood.
Anytime, I'd be delighted. Thank you.
Can you still buy these cars? Is there still cars around? And if there are, where do you get parts?
Well, I can't answer the second part of your question because I have no idea. But the first part of your question, there are still some Lafayettes around, not very many. It's estimated that about 1% of the total number of cars built, 2,267 built, the 1% of that, so 20 some cars. There was one for sale in England for about 2 years. I was lurking in the background watching it. No, you would never see them at a Mecum auction. But this car was for sale for a couple of years, and in fact, it was a 1924 four-door coupe, and it did in fact recently finally sell. I suspect it's probably still living in England. I have no idea. Not as much as I think the car should be worth, but I'm kind of a nut, admittedly.
I have a couple questions from the Zoom audience. Do you know if any of the well-known Indianapolis industrialists were involved? Allison, Fisher, any big names?
I don't know. I don't really know what the relationship was between Lafayette and other Indianapolis manufacturers, although I suspect there are a few hints, particularly in the correspondence that I referred to between Earl Howard and Edsel Ford, that there was kind of a clubby atmosphere among builders of automobiles in Indianapolis. Sean might know something about this. And in his correspondence to Edsel Ford, Earl Howard mentioned the fact that the Lafayette was being built in Indianapolis with a fine car built in a city in which only fine cars were built.
Well, I found your talk really interesting, and I learned a lot. I didn't know anything about the, Lafayette car, but I always found the sort of mysterious, murky history of Mars Hill and why it's called Mars Hill, which I think it actually was a person named Mars Hill. But anyway, what happened to all those houses that were built with all that fine timber and wooden pegs? Are any of those houses still standing or lived in?
You got it wrong.
Still there.
The houses built by the Lafayette Building Company?
Ma'am, if
Okay.
you could repeat that so the folks listening on Zoom can hear you.
We lived on Dennison Street and yes, we were always told we lived in the Heights, but they were beautiful houses, very well taken care of. And I know the people that currently live in the house I was raised in. It's beautiful. Any of the stucco homes down there are part of what you're talking about.
Is there like a neighborhood association doing anything to document these homes? Or-
I'm not aware.
Any other questions?
So if you drive through Mars Hill and you're at Mars Hill Street in Farnsworth, you go west on Farnsworth, there's a bridge. And that bridge, I think, is what delineates Lafayette Heights from Mars Hill. So like you said, people always remind us that we don't live in Mars Hill, we live in Lafayette Heights, which is only a couple of blocks down, but it truly is all of Mars Hill. But the stucco homes, if you drive around, what we've heard is that the ones that are doubles with a circular drive in the front were originally supposed to have a fountain in that circular drive. And then there were two-story stuccos, two-story stucco doubles, and any of those stucco homes were built for what we heard was the officers of Lafayette Motors. Our home was built in 1918 though, so just before I think the majority of that neighborhood was built. But yeah, y'all should drive over to 46241 and just take a look around. So I have done a lot of history on the neighborhood. I would love to know why a lot of the automotive industry that promised to come to Mars Hill did not. And if you look up a lot of the newspaper articles and things, Lafayette Motors was one of the only ones that kept their commitment.
Right.
One more question from online. Do we know why it was named Mars Hill?
I've wondered that myself.
There's a ditch called the Mars Ditch. The Holt family is who most of that farmland came from, which is why Holt Road is named Holt Road. But I think Mars Hill is just because of the Mars Ditch. I'm not sure. That's the closest answer I have.
So
I've always wondered because among other things, there really doesn't seem to be a hill in the area. It's pretty Yeah.
So we have another question over here.
Okay, sure.
I apologize because we were a little bit late getting here. Traffic coming from up north is horrible. When we walked in, you were talking about the Lafayette engine.
Yeah.
And what I saw, was it a V8?
Yes,
Okay, was it overhead cams or in block cam?
no, in block,
In block, okay. What was the displacement?
300 and, I want to say 368.
Wow, 6 liters.
Yeah.
Okay, and what did you say the horsepower was?
Well, they originally advertised the engine as having 90 horsepower, but they subsequently, by 1922, they were advertising it at 100 brake horsepower. So it was a very powerful engine.
Yeah, which is very significant for that era.
Extremely significant for the very powerful engine for that era.
So, excuse me for continuing on. Machine tools. Did I hear you right that they designed and had built some of their own machinery?
Most of their own machinery.
That was extremely unusual.
It was extremely unusual. That's why the Lafayette was such an unusual car. And that's really the most interesting thing about the car itself is the fact that that they did do that. Most of the machines used in the manufacture of the car were in fact proprietary designs invented by their own engineering staff.
So do you know, were they built here in Indiana or?
I don't know where they were built.
Okay, did any of them survive?
That's an interesting question. What I can, that in terms of the afterlife of the Lafayette, when the car was moved from Indianapolis up to Milwaukee, they moved everything. They stripped the factory of all the machine tools, desk chairs, desks, lamps, everything.
Waste baskets.
They put it on flat cars on a train, and it took them like 6 weeks to move everything, but they moved everything up to the new factory in Milwaukee, which was where they built cars from January of 1923 until sometime in the spring of 1924. I've never been able to establish when they stopped building cars in 1924, but it was sometime in the spring. Thereafter, everything was moved again because Charles Nash had purchased the remnants of the Mitchell Automobile Company, which was built in Janesville, Wisconsin. The Mitchell was built in Janesville. And he had purchased that factory and he moved most of this tooling from Milwaukee over to Janesville. And it was used in the manufacture of a new car called the Ajax, which was a low price car. It was the first attempt by Nash to build a companion make to Nash at a lower price. And so, but the Ajax only lasted for like a year, and then before it became a less expensive Nash. But I know that at least some of the tooling went from Milwaukee over to Janesville, Wisconsin. What happened to it after that, I have no idea. That would require getting access to the Chrysler Historical Collection, which is an important automotive archive, which used to be readily accessible to the public because the Chrysler Corporation had the foresight in the 1960s to create the collection, unlike most automobile companies. They actually created an archive of their own history that far back. But all that now belongs to Stellantis. Stellantis, the company that owns the remnants of the Chrysler Corporation. Stellantis has no interest in maintaining public access to the archives. And it's almost impossible to find out anything and to get access to that archive.
But it's still in Auburn Hills?
It's still there. Yes, it's still in Auburn Hills. The collection, to my knowledge, still exists, but it's just not publicly accessible.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I think we may have time for one or two more questions, if anyone has them.
This might be more of a Jason question. Was there ever a Lafayette in the greatest spectacle in racing?
I don't think so.
Yeah, by the early 20s, the passenger car, they were kind of transferring to thoroughbred racing cars. So you saw the likes of Duesenberg, you saw the likes of the beginning of Miller showing up with the engines, and then obviously the full bodies. So you would have some kind of oddballs here and there and specials made, but I don't think that Monroe was another big one at that time. that was made here, but the passenger-backed racing cars at that point were really fading away.
And also that was, I mean, despite the fact that the Lafayette had this incredibly powerful engine, that wasn't really their thing to be a muscle car kind of image. They were a refined carriage trade kind of automobile. I'm guessing that probably 75 to 90% of the cars that they built were closed bodies. They didn't build a lot of open bodied cars, and they appealed to a pretty conservative clientele.
And then I think, was there a question over here? Okay, last question.
Was Lafayette a publicly traded company, or was all that money privately offered and they had investors?
Well, throughout most of its history, it was financed by a combination of public stock and preferred stock, publicly and preferred stock. And they seem to have had a preference for preferred stock at the time. However, it became a closed corporation when when it was moved to Milwaukee, because at that time, this is all like behind the screen. It's not, doesn't really matter in terms of what the public knows. But at that time, Charles Nash actually bought the company. It became a Nash product. It became something owned by Nash. Before that time, it was separately incorporated and it was separately financed. But in 1923, it became part of Nash, and he owned all the stock, and it was no longer publicly traded.
And this was touched upon earlier, but were there any Indianapolis families that invested in it that we would know of?
I'm sure there were. I haven't gone down that rabbit hole yet.
Gotcha. Okay.
But you're giving me a new job to do.
Well, thank you guys all once again for coming out tonight. It was a great presentation. Thank you, Ralph, for your time, and keep on the lookout for more information from Indiana Automotive, especially on our summer tour at the town of Speedway in 2026. But look forward to seeing you guys and hear you guys soon. So thank you guys.